Welcome to the Lost Sci-Fi Story channel. If you're ready, let's begin today's story.
The quantum resonance calibrator had been sitting on Lira Sonn's workbench for 11 days, which was 10 days longer than she had intended, and 1 day longer than the passive-aggressive reminder Joel Hartwell had left on the shared lab console that simply read, "Still missing 1-1 calibrator, asking for a friend. The friend is me." She had meant to return it every morning and had failed to do so in the specific way that small tasks fail, not through forgetfulness exactly, but through the persistent illusion that there would be a better moment later. There was never a better moment later. There was only Joel's note, growing in quiet moral authority with each passing day, until this evening Lira finally picked the calibrator up, tucked it under her arm, and walked down the C corridor of Helix Station 7 toward the residential wing. The station was 40 minutes into its simulated night cycle, which meant the overhead lighting had shifted to the amber and blue spectrum that the Joint Habitability Committee had agreed was acceptable to 3 of the 5 species currently stationed aboard. The 2 species who found it suboptimal had lodged formal complaints in writing. The complaints were under review. They had been under review for 8 months. Lira had been stationed here for 7 of those months, and she had come to understand that under review was Helix Station's preferred state for most things, up to and including the naming of the gas giant they orbited, which the humans called GJ7 provisionally, and the Vaelith called something that translated roughly as the patient one, and which everyone else called that big orange one out the viewport. She pressed the chime on Joel's door and waited. There was a pause of the particular length that suggested a person was crossing a small living space, while also trying to remember whether the living space was in a condition fit for visitors. Then the door opened, and Joel Hartwell looked at her, looked at the calibrator under her arm, and produced the expression of a man encountering a thing he had spiritually already let go of. "You kept it so long," he said. "I was going to name it." "You were never going to name it." "I had a short list." He stepped back to let her in. Reginald was a strong contender. The quarters were small in the way that all residential units on research stations were small, designed by people who had calculated exactly how much space a human needed to sleep and work without going clinically unwell, and then subtracted 10% for storage. Joel had filled the available surfaces with the quiet accumulation of a person who had been stationed here long enough to stop living out of cases. There was a data slate propped against a coffee mug, 3 books with broken spines stacked beside it, and on the windowsill, a row of small objects that Lira had never been close enough to identify. The viewport behind them showed the gas giant in its slow, indifferent rotation, its upper atmosphere braided in amber and rust, enormous and deeply unbothered by anything happening aboard the station it anchored. "Tea," Joel said, already moving toward the kitchen alcove. It was not a question. With Joel, tea was never a question. It was a unilateral decision in which you were welcome to participate. "If it's the black one," Lira said. "It is always the black one. I have 7 varieties and I make the black one." He disappeared around the partition. "Put Reginald down gently, he's been through enough." She set the calibrator on his table with appropriate care. And then, because she was a scientist, and because the habit of observation was so deeply ingrained it operated even in social situations, she began to look at the room properly. This was the first time she had been inside Joel's quarters. 7 months of shared lab space, of competing over the spectral analyzer and arguing about data interpretation, and once, memorably, of a containment alarm that turned out to be caused by Joel's lunch reacting badly with the lab's atmospheric sensors. And this was the first time she had crossed the threshold of the place where he actually lived. It was different from the lab. It was full of the evidence of a specific person rather than the neutral functionality of shared workspace. The plants on the shelf were real, not synthetic, which surprised her. The books were annotated in the margins in handwriting she recognized from the lab whiteboards. There was a jacket hung on the back of a chair that had a small tear at the left elbow, carefully but imperfectly mended, which told her something she couldn't quite name. She moved along the bookshelf slowly, reading titles, noting objects. Her species had evolved in dense communal settlements where reading an environment was as natural as reading a face, and she did it automatically, without intent, cataloging the small objects on the windowsill. The geology reference texts, the mug that read world's most adequate physicist in faded lettering, which she had always found quietly hilarious in a way she had never mentioned to Joel, because she suspected he was fond of it. The photograph was between the geology text and the mug, a plain metal frame. Two humans in formal uniforms at some kind of ceremony, standing close together with the ease of people who had been in difficult places side by side. She picked it up because of the insignia on the left breast of the uniform, a designation she didn't recognize, and she had made it a quiet project to learn the coalition's organizational markers. She looked at the insignia. Then her eyes moved, the way eyes do to the face. The calibrator nearly hit the floor. Joel came around the partition with 2 cups of tea and the particular expression of a man who had successfully completed a small domestic task and was feeling quietly good about it. He had even found the good cups, the ones without the hairline cracks, which he considered a minor personal achievement worth acknowledging. He was in the middle of saying something about the water recycler's latest calibration adjustment, and how it had made the tea taste faintly of ambition and disappointment, which he felt was a philosophical step too far for station engineering, when he registered that Lira had not moved. She was standing at the bookshelf exactly where he had left her, which should not have been notable, except that Lira Sonn was a person who was always in motion, cataloging, adjusting, picking things up, and putting them down with the focused restlessness of someone whose mind ran several degrees faster than any given situation required. She was not in motion now. She was standing with the photograph from his shelf held in both hands, and the faint luminescence along her jaw, which in 7 months he had come to read like a secondary emotional display, had gone the color of cooling ash. He set the cups down on the table with great care. Lira. She didn't answer immediately. Her eyes were on the photograph, and they had the quality of someone reading a text in a language they were not supposed to know. "Who is this?" she said. It came out flat, without the upward inflection that would have made it a question. It was the shape of a question with all the uncertainty removed. Joel looked at the photograph. He knew exactly which photograph it was. He knew exactly which face she was looking at, because there were only 2 faces in it, and one of them was his. He did a rapid internal calculation of the kind that people perform when they realize a conversation has arrived before they were ready for it, assessed his options, and arrived at the conclusion that there were no good ones, only honest ones. He sat down. Lira watched him sit down. "That," she said quietly, "is not a reassuring response." "I know." He put his hands around his teacup, not because he wanted tea, but because having something to hold seemed necessary. "That's Ren Callister. We served together for about 8 months in the outer coalition rotation 3 years ago. He's my closest friend." He paused. "He's stationed at Vaelith Research Outpost right now, about 11 hours from here." Lira set the photograph down on the shelf with a precision that suggested she was concentrating very hard on the physical act of doing so in order to have something to concentrate on. Then she turned around and Joel saw her face properly and understood that whatever was happening was not small. "His name," she said, "is not Ren Callister." The room was quiet enough that the station's ventilation system was audible, its low mechanical breath cycling through the amber-lit air between them. Joel said nothing, because he was a perceptive man and he had learned that silence, deployed correctly, was the most honest response available to someone who needed a moment to accept what they already suspected. Lira sat down across from him, which she did the way Vaelith sat, spine very straight, hands placed with deliberate symmetry on her knees, the posture of someone whose culture had formalized the body's response to difficult news into something that at least looked composed. His name is Sorvath. His full designation is Sorvath Nkale, and he was a field engineer attached to the Vaelith drift evacuation convoy. He was on the transport that was destroyed. She stopped. Then, with the particular precision of someone reporting a fact they have memorized not because they wanted to, but because grief has a way of calcifying certain information into permanence. 3 years ago, I was told there were no survivors. Joel closed his eyes for approximately 2 seconds. When he opened them, he looked like a man who had just watched 2 separate timelines arrive at the same coordinate and collide without warning. There were 14, he said. It took weeks to correct the manifests. The administrative error wasn't caught until he stopped. He could see from her expression that the administrative details were not the part she needed right now. He was listed as deceased in the civilian notification system. By the time it was corrected, the notifications had already gone out. He paused again, and this time the pause had weight to it, the weight of something he was deciding whether to say. He knew, by the time he was well enough to be told anything, he already knew that everyone had been informed that he was dead. And another pause. He didn't correct it. The ventilation system breathed. The gas giant turned outside the viewport, enormous and patient. He didn't correct it, Lira repeated. He requested a reassignment under Coalition human designation. I don't know the full details of how it was arranged. I only know that someone helped him, and that by the time I met him, he had been Ren Callister for about 4 months and had no visible interest in being anyone else. He looked at her steadily. I asked him once where he came from. He said somewhere that didn't exist anymore. I thought he meant it metaphorically. Most people who say things like that mean it metaphorically. He picked up his tea, took a sip that was less about tea and more about doing something with his hands, and added, with the helpless honesty of someone who had run out of ways to soften anything, I would like to formally note that I am having a very difficult time right now, and I have offered you no biscuits, which is a failure of hospitality I intend to correct immediately. And he got up and retrieved from the cabinet a package of the driest, most structurally ambitious biscuits available on the station's commissary, set them on the table between them, and sat back down. Lira looked at the biscuits. She looked at Joel. Something moved across her face that was too complicated to name cleanly, too much happening at once, the old grief and the new information running into each other at speed. She reached out and took a biscuit. She did not eat it. She held it in both hands like a small, inedible anchor. "Does he know?" she said finally, and her voice was steady in the way that things are steady when a very large effort is being made, "that I'm here?" Joel did not answer her question immediately, which was itself a kind of answer. He looked at the table, then at the biscuit package, then at some middle distance between them where difficult truths apparently gathered before being spoken aloud. The ventilation system continued its indifferent cycling. Outside the viewport, the gas giant offered no assistance. "No," he said. "He doesn't know you're here. He doesn't." He stopped, reorganized. "I didn't know about you. He never mentioned." Another stop. Joel Hartwell was, in most circumstances, a fluent and precise speaker, a quality that had made him an effective researcher and an occasionally insufferable lab partner. And watching him lose the architecture of his sentences in real time told Lira more about the severity of the situation than anything he had actually managed to say. "He doesn't talk about before. I knew there was a before. There is always a before with people like Ren. But he kept it. He kept the whole thing behind a door, and I learned not to knock on it because when I did he would get very quiet in a way that made the room feel significantly smaller." Lira had not eaten the biscuit. She was still holding it with both hands, which was the closest thing available to the formal grounding, object her species used in the early stages of the Sorvathian. The Sorvathian was a structured mourning cycle, 3 months of precisely observed ritual, communal and witnessed, and deeply codified, because the Vaelith had understood for a very long time that grief without architecture simply became weather, something that happened to you rather than something you moved through. She had completed it. Every stage, every observance. She had stood in front of a registry official and formally dissolved the bonding contract, which required speaking aloud the name of the lost and the date of the loss, and a declaration of acceptance that the Vaelith language had a specific word for sorvith, the acknowledgement that a person was no longer anywhere you could reach them. She had said it. She had meant it. She had gone back to work and then to a new posting and then to this station with its amber night cycles and its unresolved committee deliberations and its one colleague who made tea with religious dedication. She had done everything correctly. The specific absurdity of having mourned correctly for someone who had spent those 3 months requesting reassignments and choosing a human name was a thing she could not look at directly yet. The way you cannot look directly at certain frequencies of light without equipment designed for the purpose. Her cold running had engaged 10 minutes ago. She could feel it, the familiar shift, the emotional centers stepping back and handing the controls to the analytical ones, with the Vaelith equivalent of "we'll take it from here, go sit down." It was not numbness. It was more precise than numbness. It was the sensation of the mind deciding that the only navigable path through a thing this large was to measure it first. "The Vaelith Research Outpost," she said. Joel looked at her carefully. "Yes, that's a coalition xenobiology station. 11.4 hours at standard courier velocity from Helix 7. She paused. "I looked up the transit routes when I first arrived on the station. Standard orientation habit." "That is," Joel said, "a very reasonable orientation habit." And then, after a beat, "I am going to pretend, for both our sakes, that you haven't just calculated a travel time. I haven't decided anything." "No, of course not, absolutely not." He picked up his tea with both hands. "You're simply noting in a purely informational capacity that the distance is crossable. Distances are generally crossable. That's what distances are. That's philosophically airtight, and I have no response to it." She set the biscuit down on the table, looked at it for a moment, and then picked it up again and ate a piece of it. It was, as she had expected from the texture of similar commissary items, extraordinarily dry. The kind of dry that suggested the manufacturer had taken the concept of shelf stability as a personal challenge and refused to concede. She chewed it with the expression of someone performing a cultural ritual they were committed to seeing through. "These are terrible. They survive a station decompression event," Joel said. "I find that comforting. That is a deeply human way to select a food. We've been through a lot historically. It left marks." He watched her for a moment. How are you doing? And I'm asking sincerely, not conversationally." Lira considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Vaelith did not perform wellness in social settings the way she had observed humans doing. The reflexive fine, thanks that humans deployed like a small shield against actual inquiry. Her species had a medical term for the state she was currently in. Velsorath, literally translated as the reopening, referring specifically to the neurological experience of grief protocols being reactivated after formal closure. It was documented. It had a treatment pathway. The treatment pathway involved a registered grief practitioner, community witnesses, and a new formal ceremony, none of which were available on Helix Station 7 at this hour, or possibly at any hour, given that she was one of 4 Vaelith aboard, and she was reasonably certain the other 3 would find the situation aggressively awkward. "I completed the Sorvithian," she said. "The full cycle. I filed the dissolution. I said his name in front of a registry official and declared acceptance." She looked at the viewport. The gas giant turned. "In my species framework, I finished grieving him. The process has a defined end point specifically so that people can reach it and move forward. I reached it." She paused. "The process does not include a contingency for the lost person having simply moved to a different sector under a human name. I imagine the registry form doesn't have a checkbox for that." "It does not." "For what it's worth," Joel said quietly, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry I didn't know, and I'm sorry I didn't ask more questions, and I'm sorry that you're sitting in my quarters eating a terrible biscuit when you should." He stopped. "I don't know what you should be doing. I don't know what the right thing is here." "Neither do I," Lira said. "That's the first honest thing either of us has said in the last 20 minutes. Joel acknowledged this with a small, pained nod. Outside, the gas giant continued its slow and majestic indifference, lit amber along one curved horizon where the star caught it. It had been turning like that for 4 billion years before anyone arrived to argue about what to name it. It would be turning like that long after every committee on Helix Station had dissolved. There was something almost offensive about how little it cared. Lira looked at the photograph, still sitting on the shelf where she had replaced it. She had not taken it with her and had not handed it back, and it sat between them like an open question dressed in a metal frame, and the question it was asking had 11.4 hours of empty space built into it. "Does he ever," she started and then stopped and started again more carefully, "when you talk to him, does he ever seem like someone who is missing something?" Joel was quiet for long enough that she knew he was not searching for the answer, but deciding whether to give it. "Sometimes," he said finally, "when it's late and we're on a long transmission, he looks at whatever viewport is nearest and goes somewhere else for a minute. Just a minute. And then he comes back and makes a joke, and I let him because that's the arrangement." He turned his cup slowly in his hands. "I always figured it was the war. People who have been through what he's been through, they have rooms in them that are just sealed. I thought it was that." "Maybe it is that," Lira said. "Maybe," Joel agreed. "Or maybe it's something that looks a lot like a person who is trying very hard not to remember the name of something he's not sure he's allowed to miss." The biscuit was still partially in her hand. She finished it. It was still terrible. She was grateful for it anyway, for the small concrete reality of it, for the way it gave her hands something to do while the rest of her processed the fact that somewhere 11.4 hours away, a man she had formally declared lost was looking at viewports and going somewhere else for a minute before coming back with a joke. She knew that minute. She knew exactly where it went. Lira left Joel's quarters at the end. She remembered the specific quality of his attention, which had always felt like being the most interesting thing in the room. She remembered an argument they'd had about the navigational ethics of the outer drift routes that had gone on for 3 hours and ended in complete disagreement, and a dinner that was somehow better for it. She remembered the last transmission before the evacuation, which had been brief and technical, and had ended with him saying her name once, just her name, in the particular tone that meant he was going to say something else and had decided against it, and she had let him decide against it because there would be time. There had not been time, and then there had been the registry official and the formal words and the sorveth, the acknowledgement, and she had meant it. She had genuinely meant it, which was the part that sat in her chest now with the most specific weight, because meaning it had been the only way to go forward, and going forward had brought her, through a sequence of postings and applications and one unremarkable decision to request a xenobiology assignment on a joint research station above an unnamed gas giant, to within 11.4 hours of him. The universe, she thought, had either a very refined sense of narrative or absolutely no conscience whatsoever. In the morning she went to the lab and she worked, because the data did not care about her personal situation, and the spectral readings from the lower atmospheric sampling didn't process themselves. Joel arrived 40 minutes after her, which was his standard schedule, and he put tea on without being asked, and set a cup beside her workstation without comment, and went to his own console and began reviewing his overnight model outputs with the focused industry of a man who was also not going to bring something up until he was invited to. She had always appreciated this about him. She appreciated it more now. They worked in silence for an hour, the kind of silence that has content. Eventually Lira said, without looking up from her data, "I'm going to transmit to Vaelith Outpost." Joel's typing stopped, then resumed, then stopped again. "Okay," he said, "I'm not going to go there, I'm going to transmit." She moved a data column on her screen that didn't strictly need moving. There's a difference. There absolutely is. A transmission is just information. It's correcting an informational error. He believes a certain set of facts to be true, and some of those facts are inaccurate. And as a scientist, I find inaccurate facts professionally distressing. That is, Joel said carefully, a completely legitimate framing. I'm not saying I've decided anything beyond the transmission. No, of course not. The transmission doesn't obligate either of us to anything. Transmissions rarely do. She looked up from her console. He was watching her with the expression he usually reserved for equipment readings that were doing something unexpected, but not necessarily wrong, attentive, non-committal, professionally curious. "Stop being reasonable," she said. "It's making me suspicious." "I'm always reasonable. You argued with me for 40 minutes last week about whether the atmospheric sampler was named Gerald. It behaves like a Gerald. That's an observable pattern. It's a machine. Gerald is a machine who has opinions about humidity levels, and I stand by that." He turned his chair toward her fully. "Lira, transmit. Whatever comes after that, you figure out after that." He paused. "And for what it's worth, Ren is a good person. He made a decision that made a specific kind of sense in the worst moment of his life, and he has been living in it for 3 years, and I think some part of him has known it wasn't finished. That minute he goes somewhere else." Joel turned back to his console. "I think that minute is you." She held that for a moment. Then she opened a new channel on her secondary console, filed it under personal transmission, encrypted, standard coalition relay, and began composing. She did not write a great deal. She was Vaelith, and her species had learned to be precise with words that mattered because imprecision in important moments was a form of disrespect to the moment itself. What she wrote was true, and it was short, and it contained her name, and his real name, and the name of the station, and nothing that demanded anything of him except that he know the distance between them had changed its nature, that the space between here and there was no longer empty in the way he had needed it to be. She told him she had completed the Sorvathian. She told him she was not asking him to undo 3 years. She told him she was only asking that the file be reopened because she was a scientist and she found incomplete data professionally intolerable, and she would very much like to know how the story actually ended. She sent it before she could edit it into something smaller. Then she picked up her atmospheric data and went back to work, because the gas giant's lower thermal layers had produced an anomalous reading overnight that had nothing to do with any of this and everything, in the way that science has of remaining stubbornly interesting even when a person is quietly falling apart, to do with keeping her functional until the answer came. The calibrator sat on her workbench where it had lived for 11 days, finally returned and finally where it belonged. Gerald, the atmospheric sampler, cycled through its readings with characteristic opinions. Joel made a second cup of tea without announcing it and left it beside her elbow, and she drank it. And outside the shared viewport, the gas giant turned in its ancient, patient arc, lit along one edge by a star that didn't know or care what was happening aboard the small station in its orbit. And Lira Sonn, who had finished grieving and then had to learn how to start again, sat with the quiet revolution of what she had just done settling into her bones like a new kind of gravity. Not the weight of loss this time, but the stranger, more vertiginous weight of a story that was not, after all, finished. She found, to her considerable surprise, that she was not afraid of it. She was something else entirely, something that had no clean single word in either language she thought in, something that lived in the specific coordinates between dreading an answer and needing it anyway. She would wait. She had become, over 3 years, quite good at waiting. The difference was that this